So hello everyone, welcome. This is our second series of collegial conversations, and today we'll be talking about how to working effectively with interpreters within the school setting. We're excited to speak about these, particularly the context of how to foster family engagement, as well as how to working with interpreters in when we're thinking about trauma-informed and culturally responsive interventions. So just a quick acknowledgement. Our project is PFS CARE, and this program is supported by the Institute of Educational Sciences and in collaboration with Arizona State University. So just a quick overview of the agenda for today. So we'll do some welcome and introductions. Then we'll do a quick brief exercise, checking in with our emotions, especially in the context of working with interpreters, because sometimes being in a place when we don't know a language, or we're working with families that don't fully understand what we're saying, can generate hard emotions. So we'll touch on that briefly. Then we'll just talk about what an interpreter is, what interpreters do and what they don't, as well as what are the things that we should be keeping in mind when working with interpreters, so the do's and the don'ts. And we'll briefly talk about the challenges that school settings do experience when working with interpreters. We also are going to be talking about how to infuse a trauma-informed and culturally responsive lens when working with interpreters and families. Lastly, we'll talk about how to overcome some of the challenges that might arise, and we'll hold a Q&A if there are any questions, and we'll end there. So welcome and introduction. So just a brief introduction about myself. My name is Ana Maria Melendez. I am currently a doctoral candidate at Arizona State University. I am working on finalizing my doctorate degree in family and human development, and I am particularly interested in studying how to foster sustained engagement of families within programs and interventions that take on a trauma-informed and culturally responsive approach. I'm doing this in hopes to help break barriers to health disparities and tailor programs that are more responsive to communities that might be a higher risk to experiencing adversity as well as social exclusion. I am too a clinician. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been for about 6 years working within community settings, providing child and family therapy, particularly using trauma-informed based approaches, frameworks, and family systems and strength-based approaches. So this is an activity that we had planned for today, but I'll just briefly talk about this activity just to generate some discussion about what it's like to working with an interpreter. So I just want each of you to think about the following questions. So just think about what emotions arise when you think about working with an interpreter. So for yourself, for families, as well as for other people you might be working with. And just wanted to bring this up briefly because a lot of the times working with someone that doesn't fully understand us, or working with someone that doesn't truly connect with us in a verbal manner, can foster some negative feelings, can be feelings of frustration, can be feelings of not being empowered, can be feelings of feeling inadequate in a space, and this can too influence family engagement within an educational setting. So this is sort of like a reflective exercise to get us started with working with interpreters, because it's the truly collaborative relationship that we have to hold with interpreters and families to make sure we are working efficiently in that relationship. So just to elaborate a bit more on what I had asked us to think about is the fact that it can be very stressful and complex to engage with families whose primary language is different than ours, whether it's English or Spanish or a different language. It can become a barrier. It can become a barrier to engagement, and it can also make families feel unsafe. So it's really important for us as educators, and as well as for people working in a school setting and people working alongside an interpreter, to reconsider what the context of the family is. So what historical experiences and barriers do families have, or they had in the past, that might contribute to their barriers in engaging when working with an interpreter? So we can think about instances where they needed to be heard, they needed to be understood, and because they didn't fully speak a different language, or they didn't fully speak English, their feelings were dismissed, or they had some barriers within the educational system, and they couldn't really convey a message, and those feelings of frustrations can arise, and those feelings of frustrations can become stronger and stronger and stronger, because families are feeling like, as they're not being heard, they're not being taken into account. So we'd really have to reconsider the historical experiences and barriers that families have gone through before when trying to engage with families in this context. It's also very important that we reflect on families' experiences and challenges communicating. And this is very important because oftentimes families feel powerless. They can feel powerless for not being able to do something as simple as communicating, as telling a teacher, as telling a school staff that the kid is sick and they cannot go to school, that they couldn't get the homework done because they don't know how to put it in words. So it's really important to reflect on that and even try to put ourselves on their shoes. How does it feel when we cannot communicate something efficiently in a different language? And how does it feel not being heard? So that could really trigger feelings of not being empowered, and that could, of course, have a spillover effect on family engagement throughout the school year. And so reconsidering and reflecting on these experiences is a big opportunity to change our practices, to put everything in context and consider the interaction from the family's perspective. And this is because positive experiences communicating with families, whether it is through an interpreter or not, really has the potential to alter the way parents and students interact within the school system for the entire year and beyond. So let's talk a little bit about how to work effectively with an interpreter. So first off, let's just talk about what an interpreter is. And there are some misconceptions about what an interpreter is. A lot of people think that an interpreter is just a person that speaks a different language. And that's a misconception, because it's a bit misleading. Just because you speak a different language does not mean you can provide interpreting services efficiently. Because there is a lot that can be lost in that translation or a translational piece. So interpreters are or serve as the verbal connections between people who need to communicate but who do not speak the same language. To become an interpreter, you need a specific type of training and a specific type of certification. And this is because language is more than just verbal language. And then we'll get more into that within the next minutes. So we have to consider more than just verbal language. What do interpreters do? They facilitate communication and they represent information accurately. And to do that, we have to consider all the layers of language. Again, when language is nonverbal, the dynamics of communication, the context in which things are being said. So that's one of the primary differences between just interpreting and translating information. The other piece is that translators, they have to do with written communication as opposed to verbal communication or spoken communication. A translator only translates text that is on paper, so written, whereas an interpreter considers the context, considers the context, considers the dynamics of communication, as well as nonverbal communication. So it's really important to know these differences. So let's talk a little bit about how to work efficiently or effectively with interpreters. So the do's. So first, introductions are very important, particularly we're working with families that might have negative historical experiences communicating or engaging within school system. Introductions are important. And why? Because when we introduce ourselves, when we introduce the interpreter, that builds safety, it builds rapport. When we do introductions, it's also very important to lay out expectations. What is an interpreter there to do? What's the role of an interpreter? And here is why, because sometimes we'll be discussing information that might be sensitive to parents, to families. So expectations are really important. It also allows families to ask questions. It allows families to know how the dynamic is going to go. So it's really important to allow for introductions for the family as well as the interpreter. Another big piece, and we should always think about, is acknowledging the interpreter as a professional in communication, not just as an extra person being in the room, but this is a professional in communication that is going to be there assisting in that connective piece, you know, in helping the family be understood, in interpreting the language in a way that is accurate, and considering all the contextual things that go into communication practices. So we have to acknowledge this person as a professional in communication. We also have to think about who do we speak to. It's very common to speak to the person you are referring to. And this oftentimes avoids speaking to the family or dismisses the family as being in the room. And this is very important, that instead of speaking towards the interpreter, we have to speak towards the family. We have to speak directly to the family. We have to maintain good eye contact to the family, because we are using an interpreter as a third person that is facilitating the communication, but the information is not being said to them. It is being said to the family. So it's really important to speak directly to the family instead than speaking directly to the interpreter. We also have to watch our pace. We have to be mindful that interpreting is a process. It's not automatic. It's not something that happens within seconds. Though it's real-time interpreting, it takes a little bit of time. So we have to watch our pace for both the interpreter and the family. So the family really gets the message we're trying to convey, and we also give an opportunity to the interpreter to interpret the message and the communication we want to convey to the best of their abilities. Everything must be interpreted, and so this is our role. We have to ensure that the interpreter interprets everything that we say. Okay, we have to, again, make sure we have appropriate eye contact. I mentioned it before, but we have to have appropriate eye contact with the family. Again, the eye contact has to go to the family instead of the interpreter. So the conversation and the communication we might be having with the family within the school setting is more personable. So appropriate eye contact. And allowing time for questions. Again, interpreting is not a cookie cutter technique. Interpreting takes time, and we have to consider the context. So we have to consider the context in which we say things. We might say something that might not be directly, we cannot interpret it directly into that other language we are trying to communicate. So we need to allow time for questions when the message is unclear. So that's really important to keep in mind. So what are the don'ts? What should we not do when working with interpreters? So we really have to make a huge effort to not engage in independent conversations. And this goes both ways. We should not engage in independent conversations with the family, and we also should not engage in different conversations with the interpreter. Interpreters should never engage in conversations independently with families outside of the context of communication between that interaction between teacher and family. So that's really important. And I know sometimes it's really easy to just get sidetracked and talked about the weather, talked about other things, but we really have to be mindful of not engaging in independent conversations, because that could really impact the relationship between not the relationship, but the dynamic between interpreter and family. We've seen this happening a lot, and I know we try to be resourceful because there is a challenge and we have to face the challenge. Interpreters are not always available within our settings or the settings in which we need them to be. And sometimes we just have to be resourceful, and we use children. We use children that might be bilingual and that might speak both languages. But we have to be really, really, really careful to not engage in that practice. And this is for many, many reasons. Because first of all, it's not their job. They're children. Children also might not have the ability to set the boundaries that some conversations that might be sensitive or might not be conversations that they might need to hear at that time are happening. And they don't really know how to set that boundary. So we don't want to use that power dynamic to have children help us out when we want to convey a message in a different language. Also, using children within that dynamic gets in the way of really trying to communicate effectively what we want to say, because we might hold back on things that we might need to say because there is a child present. And again, it's not their job, and it confuses children. It also impacts the relationship between the interpreter, or not the interpreter, but the dynamic between parent and teacher. And it's just not a best practice to engage children within this context. Something very important as well is we should never hold interpreters responsible for whatever the family says or the family doesn't say. And here's why. Sometimes we expect families to engage in certain way, to answer in certain ways, to communicate things in certain ways. And we sometimes just look at the interpreter and say, wait, why are you not saying something? So we should never hold interpreters responsible for what the family doesn't say. Instead, we should ask questions. We should clarify. We should really make our biggest effort to make sure that whatever we're trying to say is conveyed in the best way for the family to understand. We should never rush through. And this goes back to a point that I tried to make earlier. Interpreting takes time. Even though it's done in real time, it's done simultaneously, we cannot rush through. And this is because communication is complex. Communication has lots of layers. Communication is nonverbal as well. Communication has dynamics. So we cannot expect just to rush through, expect the interpreter to just rush through whatever they're trying to say in a different language, and not expect to pause and make sure that we're clarifying that the message was actually conveyed in the way we wanted it to be. A mistake that a lot of people make, and I am guilty of this, is that we oftentimes, when we realize that someone doesn't speak the same language as we do, and then we're trying to say something or have someone understand what we're trying to say, is that we start speaking louder. We start being louder with our voices. And in reality, that doesn't help, because being louder is not going to help someone understand a word that they just didn't understand from the very beginning. So instead of being louder, we have to speak slower. So speak it slower and speak in context. So you might benefit from using cues in your surroundings to make sure that whatever you're trying to communicate is communicated effectively. And we should also avoid asking multiple questions. This is for many reasons. Multiple questions are just confusing. Whether or not you speak the same language as someone else, asking multiple questions can confuse people because they don't know what to answer first. They don't know if they are answering all the questions. So we should always ask a question, let the interpreter interpret that question in the different language, and allow the family to answer that question before we, as interpreter, to ask another question. So like I said, this sounds all pretty and easy, but it's easier said than done. There are many challenges that educational settings experience when thinking about working with an interpreter. And the first and foremost is that there's limited professionals. There are limited interpreters with the adequate and needed certification and training that can provide these services. Because again, interpreting is not translating. This is one of the reasons why using children also is not a good idea, because children are likely just going to translate what they hear instead of wanting to communicate effectively the message that we are trying to convey. So we know there is limited professionals. There is a lack of professionals in our schools that can provide these services. So that's one of the biggest challenges when trying to work or trying to engage or communicate efficiently with families. And this can really have an impact in how families engage, particularly those families that were also higher risk of not engaging within the school settings because of other difficulties and adversities that they might experience under context. The second one relates to the first one, lack of certified interpreters. There might be people that know how to interpret, but they don't hold certification. And this is really important because it can have liability implications. So, and this, of course, is school dependent and context dependent, but lack of certified interpreters is something that we really have to consider when we are trying to fill this role. Different languages. A lot of interpreters that we might have available within our states might be for Spanish, but we of course know that our schools are diverse. We know that there are many other languages that are spoken, but we have lack of interpreters that can meet that demand and speak these other languages that families also speak. So that's also a challenge that appears oftentimes. Legal implications. And when I talk about legal implications is that a lot of the times, again, we try to be resourceful. We try to just help out by, if I speak a different language, I might try to help out by just translating. And this again is the difference between translating and interpreting, just translated a message. But I'm not being mindful of the legal implications, particularly when sensitive and private information is being disclosed. So that can have a legal implication within the school setting. It can have a legal implication for me as a professional, and it can have implications for families because we're not protecting their confidentiality. So we really have to be mindful of that. And the last point is privacy and confidentiality. We need to be mindful of what we say in the presence of an interpreter and what the family feels comfortable sharing as well. So those are challenges that we really need to be mindful of when working with interpreters. And we really need to do our best to avoid using other people that might know a different language and might be able to translate for us, because again, interpreting is not the same as translating. And we really have to be mindful of this because this can really have implications that can be on a larger scale. So let's talk a little bit about how to infuse a trauma-informed and culturally responsive lens to working with interpreters. And I've already mentioned a few points of how to do this, but let's really talk about how to do this within the school context and when we're trying to engage with family. So why is this valuable? Thinking about how to infuse a trauma-informed as well as a culturally responsive lens when working with interpreters is very valuable because adequate and efficient interpreting services are valuable tools through which we can foster safety and better engagement for families. It also helps us build relationships with families, and through relationships, we can build a sense of safety and we can increase the chances that our families will want to engage with us more. And once we are able to help families feel safe, once we're able to build that rapport and build that relationship, we can empower families to actually want to communicate with us. We give them a voice. So think about interpreting services as giving families a voice when they feel they don't have one. And this is very important. So this is why interpreting services need to be taken into consideration and need to be done in a proper way. Otherwise, can build barriers, particularly when we communicate something that was not meant to be said. So some strategies on how to foster safety while working with interpreters and families. So the first one is reinforce confidentiality. Like I mentioned before, there'll be times when sensitive topics are going to arise in the conversations we have with families. And a lot of families might not feel comfortable having a third person listen to these conversations that oftentimes are hard. So we have to reinforce that confidentiality with the families. We have to reassure families that interpreting our tools and interpreting is a tool to help us be understood and give us a voice. So, and this goes back to one of the points I made earlier regarding introductions and expectations. This is the perfect time to reinforce and reassure families about their confidentiality. Interpreters are also held by privacy and confidentiality standards. If it's HIPAA within the mental health setting, but also FERPA within the educational setting. So we have to really be mindful of these when talking about sensitive topics and when wanting to engage with families, particularly when we're talking about something that is difficult for families to address. We also have to be very sensitive to nonverbal communication. And this is because families can give us cues when they're not feeling comfortable. Families can give us a lot of cues when they're not feeling safe. Families can give us a lot of cues when they just don't want to talk about a particular topic. So we have to be sensitive to those cues and be mindful and respond to the cues that families are giving us, particularly when there is a third person involved, which is an interpreter. We have to also be mindful of seating arrangements. One that is best practice is triangular seating because it allows for an organic and natural interaction between the three of them. Again, we want to speak to the family, but having triangular seating gives the parent or the family the opportunity to look at both the interpreter as well as the teacher or the school staff or the other professional that is in the room. So it's one of the recommended ones. But of course, we have to also be mindful and sensitive of whatever the family's preferences are. And it might be a good idea to ask how they want to see it and how they feel more comfortable. We also have to be very sensitive when we think about jargon and idiomatic speech. We have to avoid it at all costs. And this is why, because a lot of the things we say, particularly professional jargon, might not be easily, it might not have a way to be interpreted in a different language. And so we have to be mindful for that. So we're not, but we think about this to be able to convey the message in the best way possible. And using jargon or idiomatic speech might not be the best way. So we have to be mindful of that and avoid it at all costs. If it's not avoidable because we might not find another word, we have to do our best to describe what we're talking about. And we also have to be very, very mindful of family dynamics. And this is where culture and context come to play. Family dynamics, interactions and expectations. Who is in the room? Who are we going to be addressing? Who takes the lead on communication within this family? Who do we address? Who do we talk to and who do we make eye contact to is very important. So we have to be very mindful of this and ask if we're not sure, because it's better to ask than to make a mistake, because this can really impact negatively the relationship we try to build with families. So we also have to be very mindful of rapport. And rapport is such an essential thing, not only when working with interpreters, but working with families in general. When trying and hoping to foster a positive engagement with families in the school context, we really have to be mindful on how we're building rapport. And this is because it builds relationships, and some relationships that can be enduring and can even facilitate engagement in the long run. And when thinking about working with an interpreter, building rapport is also very important, because we have to make sure the family feels safe, feels that they have a safe space to talk, to be heard and to be understood. So it's really important to allow time to build rapport and not just start with whatever it needs to, whatever we want, whatever communication we want it to be interpreted at that time. We have to also avoid stereotypical thinking and about cultural groups. And this is where cultural responsive thinking comes into mind. We are all guilty of this, and it's not because we might necessarily be bad people. It's just is within us. Holding bias against people is something that we learned socially, and we oftentimes are not even conscious about it. So this is why we have to work extra hard to be mindful of stereotypical thinking about cultural groups. Why do I think about this group? That they don't know how to communicate effectively, that they don't speak my safe language, that they're not interested in what I have to say, because this thinking, this thought process can really have an impact in the way we try to communicate with families, and can even influence how the interpreter communicates with the family as well. So be mindful of that and avoid it at all costs. We also have to encourage questions to clarify any cultural misunderstanding. We might be thinking that we're saying something that is very explicit and very easy to understand, but that might not be the case for the family. So, and a lot of the things that are said in English don't have a way to be interpreted in Spanish. So the interpreter has to find a way to say it. And I said Spanish is because it's my first language. So I just have it in the top of my head, but it could be any other language. So we have to make sure that we give enough time to the interpreter to convey the message to the best of their capabilities, and ask the family whether or not they understood it in the way we intended to say it. Why? Because cultural misunderstanding oftentimes can be offensive when we don't mean to. We can say something that for us is completely acceptable and is the norm, but in different cultures it might not be. So we really have to be mindful of that. We also have to be mindful and ask about what are preferred communication patterns within the family we are engaging with, and really let the family, let the family guide that interaction. Let the family tell us what they preferred and how they want the interaction to be. And why? Because if this fosters safety, and once family feels safe, they feel like they can actually communicate things that they might be holding back because they probably didn't feel safe in other interactions before. So we have to make sure that that is something we ask if we don't know. So to give the family that voice and that opportunity to tell us what they preferred in that type of dynamic or that type of interaction. And lastly, I encourage everyone to reflect on your own experience. So think about a time where you were in a place in which you weren't understood. And this doesn't have to be with speaking or not speaking a different language. It could be as something as simple as being in a context in which you didn't understand what was going on, and you were trying to explain yourself or understand what was going on, and people weren't understanding you because you just didn't know the context of what was going on. So think about that and think how hard that was for you. And now think about it if you had to be in that place, living that experience in a different language. So you didn't only understood the context of what was happening, but also you're not understanding what people are saying because you just don't speak that language. And you might have a need that needs to be fulfilled, and you just don't know how to say it. You just don't know how to communicate it. So again, that might bring feelings, negative feelings like frustration or unsafe feelings that families sometimes hold to, and impacts the way they are trying to engage with that. So be humble that this can actually be you. It can actually be you trying to communicate something in a way that people are not understanding you, whether it is because you couldn't find the right word, or whether it is because you didn't speak that language. So exercise humility when working with an interpreter and when working with a family that speaks a different language that you do. And this is very important. And I have this on one slide because I thought it was really important to talk about. We have to allow time, enough time for the interpreter to restructure information and present it in a culturally and linguistically appropriate manner when working with a family that speaks a different language. And this is because speaking in English does not mean thinking in English. And this links back and relates to the point that I was also trying to make earlier. Cultural misunderstandings, as well as jargon or idiomatic speech that might not be, that does not have a direct translation. So we have to give the interpreter the time to restructure the information to the best of their capabilities to present it in a safe, culturally and linguistically appropriate manner for the family to understand what we're trying to say. And again, because a lot of people think that you speak two languages, you might think in another language, but that might not necessarily be true. And this is particularly for families that, on top of, struggling with communicating, there might also be learning English. So they might be going through that process themselves. Very important as well, be trauma informed when asking questions. And we have to be extremely mindful of this when working with an interpreter, because this is a third person in the room. And again, might be sensitive information that families might not wish to share. So you have to be trauma informed when asking questions. We have to avoid blameful language and power dynamics. Okay, we have to meet the families where they're at. We have to come from a strength-based perspective, and we have to be family-centered when we are interacting with an interpreter, or when we are using an interpreter to facilitate the communication. So be really, really mindful of that. And this is because it fosters safety, respect, and empowerment. Again, if we use interpreters in an effective way, it fosters empowerment for families, and families feel empowered enough to have their own voice. Even though their voice is not coming out in the language we are used to speaking, it's coming out still. And using our voices sometimes is really hard, because a lot of the times for our families, using their voice might represent putting themselves in a very vulnerable situation. A lot of these families might have been dismissed before. A lot of these families are exhausted trying to communicate something and not being heard. So we really need to make sure that we're using interpreters as a tool to empowerment, to make sure we are giving a platform for families to hold their own voice and speak loud, and really, really, really value their input and value what they have to say. So this is really, really important. Lastly, and I think this is one of my few slides, we have to be mindful of vicarious trauma. Okay, so vicarious trauma is a secondary trauma. A lot of the times when we hear stories from families that might be rough for us to hear, that the families feel safe enough with us to open up, and we hear their stories, this can trigger feelings in us that we might not be used to, or they could just trigger feelings in us because of our previous experiences as well. So we really have to be mindful of vicarious trauma, not just for ourselves, but for the interpreter. Okay, I'm not saying we're responsible for the interpreter's feeling, but we are responsible to hold in a safe space for everyone in the communication dynamic and interaction. So we have to be mindful of that. We have to, and this is again where nonverbal cues come into play and become really useful tools to, again, foster a safe space for everyone within that communication dynamic. And also be mindful about sociocultural trauma. So sociocultural trauma, for those that might not be familiar with that term, is a trauma that relates to experiences that have to do with our social status and demographic characteristics. So a lot of it can stem from racist interactions, classist interactions, power dynamics, and structural discrimination. So we have to make room and the table to be mindful of sociocultural trauma that families might have experienced before, particularly when trying to engage in a system which is educational system, for families that might have been dismissed before, families that had experienced discrimination before and might feel that they don't have a voice on the table, families that might have experienced racism before. That is unfortunate, but it does happen. So these families might not want to speak up. So we have to be mindful of that and hold space for that in our table so families can feel safe enough, again, to have a voice. Whether or not it's through an interpreter, they're still having their voice, and having a voice is something we have to value and we have to encourage. So being mindful of both vicarious trauma for ourselves, for the interpreter, as well as sociocultural trauma of families is very important. Something that I want to mention also before we move on is that sociocultural trauma might also happen to us as professionals. And thinking about it in the context of the family can also trigger feelings that might be uncomfortable for us. So we also have to be mindful and kind to ourselves. So kind enough to recognize that we might be going through an experience like this, and this might be triggering something difficult for us, and acknowledge it. You might not acknowledge it with the family, but go through that reflection process and be kind to yourself. So just quickly, and this is where I really want everyone listening to this collegial conversation to think about how to overcome these challenges, because a lot of these challenges need a systemic answer, because a lot of these challenges have a systemic roots, and change from a challenge that has a systemic root requires a systemic change. So really think about that. Think about that when you go back to school and when you are faced with a challenge like this. But in the meantime, some things that we can use to overcome some of the challenges that we might experience in our day-to-day interaction with families are the following. So first and foremost, be family-centered. Okay, when we work with a family and we think they might not be engaging well, whether or not it is because of a language barrier, try to be family-centered. Try to value the family's input. Try to follow the family's lead. Here's why: because again, communicating is hard. Communicating in a different language is hard, and I speak from personal experience because English is my second language. So communicating effectively is really hard. And you might be in a very, very vulnerable position when you are trying to find a word and you just cannot say it effectively. So be family-centered. Follow the family lead. And this will have positive implications for building rapport, for building safety, and for helping family find their own voice. Whenever we have to be resourceful and use someone that is not a certified interpreter in the school setting, because we just have to communicate something right away, we have to be resourceful, and I get it. So try to draft confidentiality agreements within when that's happening. And by that, I mean, try to draft a generic confidentiality agreement when you're using someone that is not an interpreter. You're using it when it's not an interpreter, when you want to communicate something to a family. And this is for legal purposes and liability purposes, because you're not only covering yourself, but you are also conveying to that family that what is being said in the interaction is confidential, is private. So that fosters safety and fosters a sense of security for that family, that whatever is going to be disclosed is not going to go outside of that relationship or that dynamic instead. And always allow time for clarifications, particularly when working with someone that might not have been certified as an interpreter. Always allow time for clarifications, because you don't want a misunderstanding, a language or a translating misunderstanding to get in the way. So these are a few strategies that we can consider when working with someone that is trying to facilitate language, language between you and a family. So discussion, questions, and any comments, questions and answers. I know we do have people in real time right now, but just instead of questions, just take a time to reflect on your own experience and reflect on what family's experiences could be to build a sense of humility. And next time you're working with a family that does not speak your language, you might be able to relate to them better. So just thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for participating in this quick series. And here are our contact information. So Sarah Listrom Johnson is our PI for our project, PFS CARE. Ashley Preeps is our program coordinator, and I am Ana Maria Melendez. I'm the doctoral student working on this project, and we thank you for your time. We thank you for watching, and we welcome all questions that you might have.